you're here, welcome to my channel, and today I'm doing a book talk on The Testaments by Margaret Atwood. Now, if you follow books in any way, shape or form, you couldn't have gotten around the publication of this book. I think last week at this point. No, it's already 2 weeks ago. So The Testaments by Margaret Atwood was released. There was a whole marketing team around it. There was countdowns on books, on bookshop web pages. Like you could go to a live event, you could watch a streaming of Margaret Atwood talking about her book in cinemas all over the world. It was a really big deal. It was like another Harry Potter was coming out or anything like that. The book has also been shortlisted for the Booker Prize, which is the reason that I'm reading it, because I will say when I heard that the sequel was being written for The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, I kind of questioned its need. I didn't need a sequel, and I was like hesitant to go into it because I read Go Set a Watchman, the sequel to Kill a Mockingbird, and that was horrible. And then I was like, do I really want to do that? This is another book being published way later than the first one, and in which the first one is such an iconic book. I have since found out that Go Set a Watchman was actually published against the wishes of the author, and in this case it is of course the wish of the author because she's still very much alive. So I thought like, okay, that's one reason to maybe say that this is not going the same direction. And then when it got shortlisted for the Booker Prize, I was like, okay, like first of all, when it was longlisted, I already had this feeling, but definitely when it was shortlisted, I had like, okay, this means that there's definitely some literary merit to be found in the sequel, maybe even a potential of it reaching or getting near to the level of The Handmaid's Tale. And so I decided to go ahead and read it. And boy am I mistaken when it, well, and boy am I disappointed about this one. So I will say in advance, mine is going to be a relatively negative voice about this book. If you want a different side of the story, look for some other reviews because there are definitely people out there who enjoyed it. It's very much a book that's going both ways at the moment. You have people who really love it and you have people who really hate it. I fall on the second category. And the main reason why I hate it is because it was unnecessary. You know, I wouldn't necessarily say that any sequel to The Handmaid's Tale is unnecessary. I think it should definitely be possible to write a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale which adds information to the society and gives us a meaningful story that is worth digesting. It's just not this one. So, just for your information, I reread The Handmaid's Tale before going into The Testaments, and I will be doing a book talk on The Handmaid's Tale soon. I will probably be discussing some points that will also pop up in my discussion of The Handmaid's Tale, but for example, I won't be giving a like a description of The Handmaid's Tale in here or anything like that. I will actually also be probably mentioning something that is a spoiler in The Handmaid's Tale, so feel free to sign off if you haven't read The Handmaid's Tale yet. What are you doing in this video then? But okay. If you don't care, or if you've already had The Handmaid's Tale, please feel free to stick around. So, where The Handmaid's Tale was very much one perspective throughout, we were always following Offred, the handmaids through which we saw the Society of Gilead for the first time. This book is a three-perspective book, and I think that that is in one way already its downfall, because I don't think it was necessary to have it be a three-perspective book at all. I think the best thing for the sequel, I guess, would have been to have one perspective, in this case the perspective of Aunt Lydia, because I definitely think that that is the only interesting perspective that we are being introduced to in the sequel. However, I don't mean to say that there weren't any other possibilities, because I definitely think that the perspectives chosen aren't necessarily the ones that would have been most interesting for a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale. I think for those who are looking for more information on the Society of Gilead, who wanted more information on how the society was working, on how it got destroyed, or anything like that, for those people it would have probably been like more interesting to get the perspective that was totally different, because the aunts and the handmaids are very much closely interrelated. You know, the aunts are the ones who are teaching the handmaids the way that they need to look at the world, the lessons that they should draw out of their previous lives. And so I think they're very much interrelated a lot, and they have maybe not very much the same perspective necessarily, but they share the same story in a way. So I think it would have been very much more interesting to look at somebody who had a totally different story, somebody who was on a totally different economic scale than the handmaids and the aunts, because even if you say the handmaids have no agency, which is true, the handmaids are still seeing things through a privileged perspective. They is very much like the crown jewels of this society, because they are the ones who are providing kids to the high functionaries of this society. It would be very interesting to look at things from, for example, an econowife standpoint, or so econowives are like the wives to people in the lower classes, and you can probably imagine that like however badly handmaidens are treated, econowives are probably treated a lot worse, unless they have the luck of running into a decent guy. Second perspective that I think would have been a lot more interesting than the one from the aunt would have been from somebody in the colonies, because the colonies is kind of like the dreaded fate that is being presented to everybody in the Gilead society. Like, if you come under suspicion, if you are threatened, like either you will be killed and hanged on the wall as an example, or you might be shipped off to the colonies. Like, if a handmaiden is unsuccessful in her duties, if she doesn't manage to reproduce, then at some point she will be shipped off to the colonies. So in that sense it would have been interesting to have a look at these colonies and see, like, are things that bad in there? Also because of like current environmental issues. So the people in the colonies, they are kind of cleaning up environmental waste and things like that. So they're cleaning up what's never really clarified a lot, but it seems like they're making places that have been very much hit by either environmental disaster or maybe some sort of like industrial waste. And so it would be very interesting to look at that in light of the current discussion about climate change, and possibly also to see like the effect of the effect that this role might have on the agency of females in this role. Another interesting perspective, but I guess that is off limits in this book, would be a male perspective. So the perspective of an eye, for example. I think it would be very interesting in a feminist book to have a male perspective, especially since feminism needs to be about equality, and so it would be interesting to have a male perspective on this society as well. However, then you run the dangerous ground, of course, of people criticizing the male perspective either way. If the male turns out to be a hero, then you are presenting a male hero in a feminist literary novel, and whereas your females might be whereas your females are restricted in this society. And then if you present an evil male perspective, then you're just showing males as the enemy to females. So I think it would have been difficult to include a male perspective, though I think it would be interesting to have the perspective of an eye in the book, because the eyes are very much like the ones who are gathering information, we're very much seeking out the secrets, but in a way, as we find out in this story, the ants are very much like the eyes in that sense. Instead of the eyes actually exact justice on people, the ants very much gather these secrets and keep them as sort of bargaining chips. And so I think the ants are definitely the most interesting perspective in this book. The two other perspectives that we are given, I hope I kind of I don't think I explained the perspectives, right? I just complained about them. So the three perspectives that we are given in this book is the perspective of an ant, the perspective of a girl born in Gilead when the regime was already in full place, and then the perspective of a girl born not much later outside of the Gilead society, so in Canada. The reason why I think that these perspectives don't really work is because they are all coming from a privileged position, and we already had a relatively privileged position when we looked at the handmaids. Sure, the handmaids have a very low position within this privileged society, but still we are looking at the same pieces of the Gilead society. We're just seeing it from a higher perspective, from a more elevated position than the handmaids. And what I also think is a mistake is that the handmaids become more or less invisible within this book. You know, there are some mentions of handmaids, and there is like one close relationship in which like one of the girls is really becoming fascinated with handmaids and is really observing the handmaid closely, But for the rest of the novel, Handmaid's become quite invisible, even though they've been like the big force of the first novel. So I think, I'm not saying that a handmaid should have been like the main character or anything like that, one of the perspectives, but I do think that handmaid should have been more prominent in the book. Definitely after like the first third or something of the novel, they seem to be disappearing from the story altogether. Second problem I have with this novel, apart from the perspectives that were chosen, is suspense. There is no suspense whatsoever. I do know that people disagree with me on that, but I definitely didn't feel any suspense. You know, there's a certain plan that seems to be unrolling at some point, but at no point did I actually care whether the plan was going to be successful or not. And definitely as we got along more and more, it seemed like things were falling into place so easily. When there were hurdles, they were overcome way too easy, and that just made me feel like stakes were raised, but they weren't, you know, they weren't lived up to, you know. Even at the end, like one of these people had like a very high stake, which was most likely had consequences, but we are never shown whether they actually did have consequences or not. So yeah, I really never felt like these stakes were really that high. The stakes were high, you know, if I think about them, they definitely were high. It just never felt like them because we had a very different experience with the society as we had before. You know, before there definitely was this feeling in The Handmaid's Tale that whatever you did, people were watching, people knew about what you were doing, you could get arrested at any time. And while this is still the reality, of course, in this book, it just never felt like it. You know, nothing that was done led to any consequences. Even when people noticed it, it seemed like there weren't any real sort of repercussions, which I think is the biggest problem with this book. You know, stakes were raised, you had the possibility of huge failures, and even when minor problems popped up, they weren't dealt with accurately. And that is a big problem that I have. I really feel like I reward writers who were ruthless to the reader in a way. You know, as a reader, you obviously don't want your characters to have to go through difficult times, to have to be punished or anything like that, but it's a mistake to indulge that. You know, when you have stakes, they need to be lived up to at some point in the stories in order for your story to be believable, in order for suspense to be there. And so this was never done, and I really feel like this story is really one big indulgence towards the reader. It's very much the story that a reader would want to tell itself, but it's not the story that the reader actually needs. It's not a story that we actually deserved. So suspense is a big problem. Tied in with that is the predictability of the plot. So not just the fact that I at no point felt any suspense about it, it was also just predictable. Because of stakes not being lived up to, at certain points you just become great at knowing what's going to happen next in the book. I think another problem is that we are very much seeing more or less one story. You know, we get three perspectives, but it's very much more or less one story. It would be more interesting to have, you know, I very much like disparate perspectives in a interwoven story, but it's not done correctly here. So what I very much like is three disparate characters who at first seem to have nothing in common, and then they gradually become part of the same sort of plot in which they might work against each other or work together or anything like that. They might just pop up in each other's stories without really understanding that they are working towards the same goal or anything like that. That's very much something that I like. In this story, we are given three perspectives who at some point become so intimately part of the same plot, but they also at some point become one and the same person. Of course, I could always distinguish Aunt Lydia because she has a very different position than the two other girls, but the two other girls at some point become completely interchangeable, even though they have very different way of speaking, which is like really the one way that I could still distinguish between the two of them. And they are also becoming quite interchangeable because In the chapter heading, they refer to as like, what is it, 369A and 369B or something like that. And so they become very much like two sides of the same entity, which makes it somewhat difficult to distinguish between themselves. And they are just basically becoming the same at some point with just different, a little bit of a different take on it. But that is definitely also something that I felt was a major letdown, because I really like, that's really one of my favorite plot elements, is disparate stories coming together, but it really didn't work in this one. Another thing that I felt was lacking in this book is something that if it was let down altogether, if it was left out altogether, I wouldn't have had a problem with it, but it was introduced, but in a weaker way than in The Handmaid's Tale, which is my problem with it, because I really liked this aspect in The Handmaid's Tale. So in The Handmaid's Tale we also have a account of somebody's life, a memoir, in which she's often referring to like this relationship that she's creating with the reader, how she's creating a reader by writing, though she's actually, it's a spoken text, so we find out at the end, but so how she is creating an audience by telling her story. And this is also represented in the Aunt Lydia story, in the Testaments. She is writing down her story, and she's very much also discussing the creation of the reader and how the reader could be destroyed if this work is destroyed. But like, it's something that's only there it's a very restricted amount of screen time for this thing, for this element in the story. And but because of the multiple perspectives and this element only being there in one of the three perspectives, I felt it didn't really work as well in this one as it did in The Handmaid's Tale. Both acts of storytelling are subversive, both in The Handmaid's Tale and in the Testaments. Cannot even come up with a name. So both acts are subversive, and maybe I felt the most suspense in the Testaments about actually the discovery of this manuscript. I felt more suspense about the possibility of this manuscript being discovered than I felt about the whole plot line in which we were supposed to feel suspense. I guess that is the one thing that worked best for me in the Testaments. I do think that one of the most interesting things that we are being introduced to here is the Pearl Girls. So Pearl Girls are basically ants in training, and in order to prove like their commitment to this cause, their complete belief in this system, they are sent out into the world before they become ants, and they need to they're kind of missionaries who need to bring back somebody with them back to Gilead, who need to convince somebody that this is the true fate. And I think this is really well done. It's something that when I read about it, I was like, it would definitely make sense for this to exist in the Society of Gilead. But in another sense, I also feel like not a lot was done with this. This was just used as a plot point later on in the novel. So it's a very interesting concept, but I would have liked to see it better executed, or to see it delved into in a better way later throughout the novel. So without going into much spoilers, I cannot really say too much more about this. I don't think I want to do a spoiler section for this one, because I think that for the people who have read it, based on what I've been discussing, you can probably fill it in with what I mean by that. If you don't, definitely comment down below, and I will go back to you. I will come back to you about like certain elements that I found didn't work for me. So yeah, definitely let me know down below if you've read the Testaments, what you felt about it. I've seen so far on Goodreads, I've mainly seen 5 and 4-star reviews, which I really cannot fathom. I mean, I've decided to give this a 2-star rating, and the 2-star rating is really based off of the fact I'm really looking at it not as a sequel in order to give it a 2-star rating. If I were to look at it really as a sequel, which it is, I wouldn't even give it a 2 stars, because I've seen some reviews in which people say like, yeah, people who are you know, I've seen some people say that you couldn't expect the Testaments to reach the level of The Handmaid's Tale. that is just unfair expectation going into it. On the other hand, I feel like if you're producing a sequel, it's really marketed as a sequel, then you are setting those expectations and you are expected to live up to them. I don't feel it's unfair of me to expect the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale to live up to The Handmaid's Tale, you know. But so my 2-star rating is based on the idea that this were a standalone, that I just read it like this, and in which case I would say like it was okay-ish, which is the best I can say for it. As a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, it was a total letdown. It didn't live up to the expectation. It didn't come close to the expectation. It totally broke tone with the original. It tried to reuse certain elements from The Handmaid's Tale, but it did that in a weaker form, making it totally unnecessary to reuse them at all. It introduced some interesting elements like the Pearl Girls and like the backstory of how you make an ant, but it didn't do enough with that. I mean, I think the ant part was quite interesting, but then the later development of the ant character, to me, didn't really feel like it worked very well. So yeah, if I have to leave you with one positive about this book, it's fast. It's fast-paced, you'll fly through it. I mean, I read it in 4 evenings, so I mean, and 4 weekdays, so I didn't have time to read a whole lot in those days. And I would usually read like 80 pages an evening, which for me is a lot, you know, to read in an evening. So it's definitely fast-paced. You'll get through it in no time. If you and did it take away from my enjoyment of The Handmaid's Tale? Nope. So just as with The Handmaid's Tale, this book is being presented as a discovery of a testimony. And so just as with The Handmaid's Tale, we are left to question the authenticity of the document, the authenticity of the testimony. And so I will just make myself believe that this is a false... I really need to drink something because I really don't have a voice anymore. So I'm just going to make myself believe that this is a false testimony, something that has been brought into the story in order to make the Aunt Lydia character seem like a heroine after her death or something like that. So yeah, that's what I'm deciding to do with it. So I can still enjoy The Handmaid's Tale in its more or less perfection. And that's how I can still enjoy The Handmaid's Tale without this thing. But so yeah, see you guys next time. Bye!